You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 28, covering the week of May 23rd through May 27, 2016. This is Brian McClanahan. Welcome back. Glad to have you back on the program. And we got a few, again, housekeeping things coming up. Just a couple of weeks away now from our summer school in Seabrook Island, South Carolina, June 12th through 17th. So if you've registered for that, I'm sure that we'll love to see you there. If you haven't, you can contact Dr. Livingston. Information's on the website, and maybe able to get a last-minute slot. I believe it's full, but it may not be. So check that out. And then, of course, in August 13th, 2016, we have a conference in Atlanta, Georgia, on nullification, and a lot of great speakers will be there, so it's going to be a good time. Information for that is also available on our website. It's only a one-day conference, and it's only going to be from the morning to the afternoon, 10 to 3, so it's well worth your time to head out and come see us in Atlanta. Remember that we exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you want to donate to the Institute, keep things like this podcast going and the website and conferences and things of that nature, please consider a donation and help us out. They are tax deductible to the full extent of the law, so consider putting us into your financial plans. Okay, so we've got some interesting material on the website for this week. First and foremost, we started off the week, kicked it off with something a little different. Well, before I talk about that, a lot of people are talking about the bill that went through the Congress recently to not allow Confederate battle flags on Confederate tombs in national cemeteries. And so I'm gonna talk about that in relation to the last article of the week and some things that are going on in the United States at this particular moment. And that particular move is really unprecedented in the last 100 years. Even after the war was over and you had these reunions and other things going on in the early 20th century where Union and Confederate veterans would get together, there was no hatred for Confederate symbols. They were seen as symbols of the South and of the Confederate soldier, and there are many pictures of presidents, even Republicans, in the early 20th century in front of Confederate flags. People like Warren Harding, for example. There's a very famous picture of Warren Harding at Gettysburg where he's standing in front of a big battle flag, and Warren Harding was not to be confused with any Democrat. And so you had this reconciliation, and symbols, Southern symbols, were seen as part of this reconciliation at the time. But now we don't see it that way at all. We see it in a different light, and I'm going to talk about this in relation to Dr. Gottfried's article at the conclusion of this podcast. So keep that in mind. We haven't put anything on the website about it because, again, it's just a continual process. We've talked a lot about the PC attack on the South, and we've talked a lot about Southern symbols and things that are under attack. We had a conference on it in Charleston, so this was expected. I don't think anyone could sit down and realistically say that something like this wasn't going to happen. We noticed that every flag, every Southern flag, is under attack, really, that has any type of reference to the Confederacy. So even things like the Alabama state flag and the Florida state flag, and these flags, Arkansas state flag, these flags are under attack. As I mentioned in a previous podcast, though, they've missed some other ones, like the Maryland state flag, which has Confederate symbol in it. During the war, Maryland soldiers, Confederate Maryland soldiers, carried one part of that flag, and the Union soldiers carried the other. So you've got these two in there. And the Louisiana state flag, people would say it's not a Confederate flag, but it was adopted, essentially the same flag as the official flag of the state of Louisiana in 1861. So it's funny how our focus on this particular issue is, I mean, it's actually unenlightened and ahistorical. But again, it's expected. This is exactly what's going to happen, and I think it's only going to continue. And we're not going to see just getting rid of Confederate battle flags at national cemeteries on the graves of Confederate soldiers. I mean, really, you can't get much more benign than that in the use of the flag. So if that's going to go, well, then I don't think there's much hanging on too much of anything else in this particular regard. So we'll talk about that at the end of the podcast. But we started off the week a little something different, piece by yours truly on Southern music. And there was a new album that came out not long ago entitled Southern Family. And it's a collection of songs by various country music artists. And the point of the album is to talk about the South and the Southern family and what makes that particular concept unique. And so, of course, love of family is not a character trait that's unique to the South, but there are certain things about it that the South held on to in this relationship and family. The South held on to in so many ways longer than other parts of the United States. And so I mentioned what these are. For example, a temporal and spiritual understanding of the value of community and tradition, of self-determination and independence, of the relationship between God, man, and the environment. And these are things that Southerners long admired. And perhaps I say it's because of defeat and dislocation. Southerners had to have deep roots. They had to have tangible heroes and subtle pleasures. They had to have these things because their entire world was overturned in 1865 when they lost the war. So the South had always been an agrarian section, which gives you a different view on life. You are moving with the seasons, not by the clock. You started getting a more industrialized South at this particular point. You started seeing more people move to commerce and industry, but most Southerners still lived on farms even into the early 20th century. So their life was regulated not by the clock on the wall, but by the seasons and the clock of the sun. Right, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, and of course you're going to regulate your life in that way. Southerners lived in the dirt. They communed with the dead and wept for the living. I mean, this is why they have heroes. This is why they are so interested in tradition and history, because they could hold on to that. At a time when it seemed like there was nothing else left for them, they could hold on to history. And because of that, they're also very patient. And they had a reflective acceptance of the present, knowing that their traditions served as a reminder of better times. And that pain that they had really made great music. If you look at all the major forms of American music, they all come out of the South, whether it's country music, blues music, jazz music. And we've done a lot with that at the Institute at our conferences and talking about bluegrass and how all of these major forms of music, American music, are Southern. You can't get around that. The South really does provide the cultural flavor of the United States. And I think that's something that most people don't really realize, but it's true. And it's white and black Southerners providing this cultural flavor for the entire United States. And this particular album really hits home on all those themes. So you have several famous country musicians in this particular collection: Miranda Lambert and Jamie Johnson and Zac Brown. Then you have some people that aren't quite as famous, but they are if you're a Southern music or country music fan. But one of the more interesting pieces was by Rich Robinson, who was the guitar player for the band the Black Crowes out of Georgia, and his song is entitled "The Way Home," and it's basically a gospel piece where he plays guitar, and it's a wonderful piece. And you have a little a song by Anderson East, who's kind of like he's kind of being described like the Southern Justin Timberlake, even though Justin Timberlake is from Tennessee. But Anderson East is on this album with a more of a R&B tune. You have Hank Williams Jr.'s daughter, Holly Williams. She has a song on the piece. Waylon Jennings' song, Shooter Jennings with the song on the album. John Paul White from the Civil Wars has a song. So it's a really great album. Chris Stapleton, who's now a household name, his wife actually has a song on the album. And Chris sings along on the song too. "You Are My Sunshine," which is my favorite song on the album. But it's a great collection of what makes the South the South. And if you listen to the lyrics of the songs, it's about home. It's about Mama's table. It's about Grandma and Grandpa and the lessons that you learn in the South about living. And again, these are things that Southerners held on to. Weren't always uniquely Southern, but Southerners have held on to them longer, which is why I say, that the South is America still. If you really want to look at, as the slogan now is being run around, what makes America great, it's the South. It's the Southern tradition. Those are the things when people start thinking of, what makes America great? It comes back to that. So this is a great little piece to start the week, and I've linked to all the songs on the album if you want to listen to them before you go out and purchase it. But it's well worth the $13 or whatever it is to buy it. You won't be disappointed. On Tuesday, we ran a piece that first appeared in the Imaginative Conservative, which is a great website run by people who admire the Southern tradition. And so I'd highly recommend you go over there and look at their material. It was by Lee Cheek, who has spoken at our conferences before. He is a Calhoun scholar, political scientist, and the title of the piece is Agrarianism and Cultural Renewals. This is another theme we like to talk about, the idea of what agrarianism is and how it can be a component of a cultural renewal in the United States. And again, this is what our summer school is about, the South and the renewal of America, the Southern tradition and the renewal of America, and what the South can offer. So people go back and they'll say, even today, you can go on and read these idiots that produce websites about neo-Confederates. And there's several out there. They're all silly. They're all honestly not really worth your time, which is why I don't ever mention the names of the people, or rarely mention the names of the people who produce these things, because their little running around activities are just pointless. And one thing they miss in everything we do is, somehow they have this firm belief that people like the Abbeville Institute and the SCV and we're not a Confederate heritage organization. We talk about the South and Southern symbols and things of that nature, but the Institute is dedicated to the Jeffersonian tradition and exploring and what is true and valuable in that tradition. And one of those things is agrarianism, which a lot of leftists love, right? Look at all the Greens, the organic farmers, all these people. This is exactly what the Institute promotes. Independent, small farmers, small communities, self-determination, getting away from the state. And, of course, they don't like that. It's really funny. Some of these groups, some of these people that like to bash the Institute are against self-determination, not only in the United States, but anywhere else in the world, right? You can't have independence in Catalonia, for example. The secession of those places. I'm sure they were probably also against the secession of the Soviet republics, because that's secession. That's evil. You can't do that. You can't have self-determination. And this is how silly these idiots are. And so, again, I won't mention them by name because they're not even worth it. They have an infatuation with us, but we don't care about them. And it's funny how they do this. They'll try to troll us on social media and tag us in various things, and we just ignore that. But it's almost like the little doofus in the back of the class raising the hand. Hey, me, look at me. Hey, I'm cool. Look at me. And, they want us to call on them because they want to engage us. And so it's more fun to ignore them because we're not going to call on them. We're not going to partake in their idiocy. We're just going to ignore them. This is what Jefferson did, too, which is rather funny. When the attacks were leveled against him by people like James Callender, he just ignored it because it wasn't worth his time. And, a lot of people did this. You just ignore the attacks. They're not really worth your time. So, people that attack the Institute miss these things like this particular piece and what we're doing. Dr. Cheek says, among the contributions to I'll Take My Stand, Alan Tate's remarks on the Southern religion is usually interpreted as the most acerbic, immoderate, and unusual essay in the collection. All too often the essay is read as an apologia for violence or for an eccentric defense of tradition. In fact, Tate, like his fellow agrarians, was speaking to remind his readers of the religious and political society that was once the South. More importantly, Tate's essay is a plea for a recovery of what has been lost, a humane social order. And so he gets into that. Nourished by daily labors in the fields, it was the properly ordered agrarian community that produced a more stable and wholesome environment for families and workers than industrialism could offer. And this is the main. I mean, if you go back and you look at some of the treatises, pamphlets, books that were produced in the antebellum South, when they started talking about the antebellum Southern economy, there was this dichotomy between industrialization and what it did to workers, and of course agrarianism. And this carried forward into the 20th century, and early on, and when we relaunched the website, I wrote a piece about the Callaway family from Georgia and how the Callaway industrialists, and of course the Callaway family became very wealthy, a very prominent family in Georgia, and they had cotton mills, and one of these entrepreneurs in the Callaway family said that he essentially had cotton mills because he wanted to produce better Americans. And so they were interested in a more paternalistic view of labor. And even people who are labor historians have begrudgingly started to look at the Southern critique of industrial capitalism as something that's very valid, because Southerners were pointing out that wage labor at the time was brutal. And so look, I often tell my students, look, if you were a laborer in the 19th century, I don't care where you were, north or south, it was bad business. I mean, and the Southern critique, the Jeffersonian critique in this particular way of American labor, was highly original. And it was something that people miss about the South and how they were very critical of what they saw as the evils of industrialization. Now, we can go back and say, well, industrialization does produce a much more comfortable lifestyle for a lot of workers, and standard of living goes up and this type of thing. And you can't get around that. But even in the South today, there are groups that have been called, some of the best places to work in the country because they have a much more Southern flavor when it comes to treating their workers properly. Places like AFLAC, places like TSIS. These are organizations that really strive to do well for their workers. And I think that's something that's missed in the entire discussion of Southern society. They want to ensure that their workers are well compensated, well treated, have good benefits. I mean, this is the people that do that. This is a very Southern thing. And you saw it after the war. It was a different type of labor system. You have big feasts in the middle of the day. You come out and you've got music playing. You've got people having a good time and eating. The workers, all provided by the company. And so this is something that a lot of people didn't understand about the Southern labor system, particularly after the war. Now, Tate says, this is a quote from Cheek, according to Tate, an agrarian environment encouraged a life more conducive to religious and ethical living as well. In regard to farming, the experience of tilling the soil and harvesting crops embodied a sense of self-sacrifice and an attachment to a shared community. Farming was, by its very nature, a communal rather than a solitary act. So it lends to this idea that you're building community and that you're in touch with God. And this is what we start the week with a piece on music, and we go forward with a piece on the agrarian tradition. And so this is something that, again, is often lost as people just sit there and criticize the South and everything. They miss what really is valuable about the Southern tradition, and that's it. And so this is what makes, it has deep roots. This is what makes the South the South. And so it's a great piece, and he talks about, he goes on to talk about how the South viewed themselves, and he talks about Mel Bradford, and he says, quote, "As Mel Bradford points, the Southern spirit looked to Eden after the fall as a model, with the best of the gifts of this life, and anticipated that a fruitful social and political existence was possible only when pursued with prudence, energy, honor, and a regard for a wise prescription. The implantation of the garden as a metaphor for explaining how the Southern understanding differed from the New England version deserves our attention. Contrary to the New England understanding of precision in all religious and political arrangements, the Southern and agrarian worldview identified the ancient imperfections of a civilization with the need for an enduring pattern of improvement and refinement within human nature. A society grounded upon the rock of such a prescriptive development of religious and political thinking was less likely to be consumed by ideological deformations of their understanding." So, again, it's this root, agrarian root, that gives you a different worldview, that lets you understand human nature, that lets you commune with the dead and weep for the living. And also have joy in death, because it is a walk with God. And this does produce a localism, a community, that again is often lost in other parts of the country. All right, so then on Wednesday, it's a great piece. I'd recommend you go out and read it. On Wednesday, we had a part 33 in our installment of Sayings for Southerners by Clyde Wilson. Again, just a great collection of quotes. One that I found great was a quote by Will and Ariel Durant, and if you don't know who they are, they wrote a multi-volume history of Western civilization and won all kinds of awards. But after they produced that series, they wrote a little book entitled Lessons of History, and it's basically a book on what history is. And in this particular book, there's a quote: "The South creates the civilizations, the North conquers them, ruins them, borrows from them, spreads them. This is one summary of history." And so he's pointing out the fact that the Southern tradition, again, Southern culture was American culture, and that the North took it at the end of the war. He also has a quote from James Johnson Pettigrew, where Pettigrew said, "Our reputation next to the Greeks will be the most heroic of nations." Now, of course, we see how that's changed. It's interesting how that's not the case anymore. And he also has a quote from de Tocqueville where he says, "A false notion which is clear and precise will always have more power in the world than a true principle which is obscure or involved." So it's easy to tell a false notion because, well, it's clear and precise. But something that's complex or involved, people have a hard time believing it. And we face that every time we talk about Southern history. Okay. So the Thursday piece was Southern Reparations Have Already Been Paid. This is by Philip Lee. And Mr. Lee has taken a lot of heat recently, again, on some of these idiot blogs. They like to attack him, and then, of course, they're trying to goad us into a conversation about them. And we're just not going to do it because it's a waste of time. But this particular piece is great because it talks about how after the war was over, and so Mr. Lee has started focusing more on Reconstruction because we're in the sesquicentennial of Reconstruction. He says that, look, I mean, what happened after the war, the South was punished economically by the North for the war. And he shows this little chart where he says, quote, as the table below illustrates, for at least 25 years after the war, 3 items represented more than half of the federal budget. Budget surpluses to repay federal war debt, interest on federal war debt, and Union veterans' pensions. Former Confederates derived no benefit from such items, yet they had to pay their share of federal taxes to fund them. If the Confederacy had been an independent defeated foe, such payments would have been reparations. And then he says, but the table does not tell the whole story. First, 4 years after the war in 1869, the Republican-controlled federal government passed a law that required federal debt to be redeemed in gold. But during the war, the great majority of investors used paper money, which traded at a discount to gold, to buy the bonds. The discount got as high as 63%, meaning that a paper dollar was worth only 37 cents after Union General Grant sustained heavy casualties in the 1864 Overland Campaign, only to be stalemated at Petersburg. In short, he says, gold redemption was a huge windfall for the bondholders. Few, if any, bonds were held by ex-Confederates. Most of the bonds were held by national banks, which were required to buy them as a monetary reserve under the 1863 National Banking Act. But other Northerners also owned the bonds. Bond interest had also had to be paid in gold, which was another windfall to Northerners. So basically what's happening is Northerners are buying bonds with cheap greenbacks. And if you know anything about what happens during the war, this is part of Reconstruction. You get the implementation of the Hamiltonian system. And if you look at some principled men in the North at the time, they were fearful of what was happening here, that they were wrecking the economy by issuing these greenbacks. And then you have the fraud that comes out of this. So you buy bonds with inflated paper money, and it's really not worth anything. And then 4 years after the war, you say, we're going to pay you back in gold. So you're going to make a huge amount of money because these paper dollars were worthless, but now you're paid back in real money. So this is ingenious. Now Southerners are having to pay taxes to fund these things. He also says, second, Union veteran pensions did not stop growing until 1921, which was 50 years after the war ended. Moreover, the total amount paid was about twice as much as the combined federal and northern state governments spent to fight the war. By 1893, Union veterans' pensions represented 40% of federal spending. I mean, just amazing how bad economic Reconstruction affected everything. I mean, how it was such a major disaster for laborers and what's going on here in the U.S. So when you look at the late 19th century, and people often are critical of the late 19th century, this is, more than anything else, a continuation of Reconstruction. The Gilded Age only was possible because of economic Reconstruction, and we often don't consider that, but it's true. All right, finally on Friday, we had a piece, Our American Cultural Revolution by Dr. Paul Gottfried, and this piece was delivered April 16th at the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. It was the Murray and Rothbard Memorial Lecture. And I'm not going to go into reading too much of it. There's actually a video at the end of the piece. This was originally published on the Unz Review and then also on LewRockwell.com. I'm not going to go into reading it, but one thing that was interesting about this particular piece was Dr. Gottfried's discussion of the state and what the state does or what it has done. And he's talking about political correctness. And again, we open with a discussion of this in relation to flags at national cemeteries. And so he talks about what's happened here. And he says that political correctness is not a creation of the state. It's just fostered by the state. And he says that Quote, "In conclusion, I would note that unlike Murray and many in this room, I have never presented myself as someone who regards the state in any categorical sense as the enemy. In historical perspective, I can appreciate the state as a Western invention in pulling Europe out of feudal anarchy, promoting safety for its subjects, and providing a political framework for the growth of historic nations. At times, the state has been a generous benefactor to humanistic learning, and one can cite as an example the Habsburg rulers of Austria-Hungary, who generously patronized the early exponents of the Austrian School of Economics. I would further note that public support of American education has not always led to its present unspeakable evils. There was a time when government did not make war on the traditional family, gender roles, and religious liberties." But he says, but that was in the past. And so what he's talking about here is limiting the state to its smallest form, essentially the local community. And I think this is interesting because what has happened, over time, and I've made the point in several things that the state has never really conserved anything traditional. That when you try to do this, when you try to use the state as a vehicle to conserve something, eventually the state will be used against it. So the best way to conserve anything is through private work, whether it's through the family, the home. You're trying to conserve a particular culture or worldview or something like that. You have to do it at home first. You have to preserve it in your own family. That's the only way these traditions survive. You cannot codify them in the state because eventually they will unravel. And so what happened in the early 20th century, and applying this to what's going on with the Southern symbols, the states tried to pass legislation that would make it very hard to remove statues or symbols or things of this nature. But all of that's coming apart because they're on state property. And so whoever controls the state at that particular moment can undo those things and can just pass new legislation. The monuments that are not under any type of attack are those on private property. And we ran a piece not long ago about the Tuskegee Confederate Monument, which is privately owned. It will never come down because it's privately owned. And I think this is what people have to start realizing. The best way to protect these things is to privately own them, to have these things on private property, and then no one can touch them. So long as that property is transferred to an organization that will never sell the property or get rid of it, you'll never have to worry about it. So Southerners had a belief, as Dr. Gottfried said, that the state was the final hedge against this unconstitutional tyranny or cultural tyranny or whatever it was. But what we found is that the state can never really do that because the state can't really conserve anything in the long term. And it will only, as it can be used to destroy culture and civilization. And I think that you see that throughout the trend of human history more than anything else. I mean, you do have, state codification of culture and tradition, but eventually that mechanism, that apparatus is taken over by someone else who's not for it, and then it all comes unraveling. It all starts to unravel. So what you have to do then, as he's saying, you got to get it to the small. But even that you have to worry about. So the best way to preserve any type of tradition or culture is through private activity, right? I mean, how do you preserve the agrarian tradition? Well, you have farmers. How do you preserve Christianity? You do it in your home. How do you preserve, heroic tradition, ancestor stories, these type of things? You tell your kids and your grandkids, and then they believe those things, and then they talk about them. That's how traditions and customs and culture had always been passed down. And it didn't really matter what the state said, but you basically withdraw at this point. Because the state is now the vehicle for attack, you withdraw from it. You say, enough. I'm not going to participate in your state. I'm not going to participate in your policies. I'm just going to withdraw from them. I'm going to try to leave my life as much as I can away from you. And therefore, you do not give your consent. So I think this is where, Dr. Gottfried is realizing that political correctness, again, it's not created by the state. The state, though, becomes the vehicle for people that can use government to do one thing or another. And so this is why the state can always be considered, at the end of the day, a dangerous thing. For either side, this is something that, when I talk about presidential, executive power and how dangerous that is. For either side, because when your guy's in office, you're comfortable with executive power, but when the other guy's in office, you're not. And what we need to be is just uncomfortable with executive power. We need to be uncomfortable with state power. Because what it lends to is what we're seeing right now with this PC assault on not just the South, but anything really traditional in America. That's the real problem. And people realize it, but they don't know what to do about it. Well, you just don't give your consent. You withdraw. Now, I know that we've talked about, we're having a conference on what you can do about it, various state action, but what we're going to talk about is, in that particular conference, is also what the people can do about it, the people themselves. So there's two different ways of looking at the state, and I think that this piece, and it gets into this politically correct assault on American culture, and he talks about the South and how this has become part of it, how we need to start thinking about that in relation to the state. All right, so we hope you enjoyed the podcast. A little shorter this week, but we'll see you next week for the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.